Police officers, what domestic violence call made you turn in your badge that same night? The dispatch came through at 11:30 on a Wednesday night. Code for domestic disturbance at 1847 Maple Grove Avenue in the suburbs, where houses had manicured lawns and two-car garages. I was 3 months from retirement after 26 years with the department, counting down shifts until I could collect my pension and never wear this uniform again. My partner that night was Officer Jamal Foster, 28 years old, eager and still believing the job meant something beyond paperwork and politics. We pulled up to a colonial-style house with all the lights blazing, neighbors standing on their porches watching the show. A woman stood in the driveway wearing a bathrobe, blood streaming from her nose, holding a crying child against her chest. The child was maybe 4 years old, small enough to hide his face in his mother's shoulder. The woman's name was Rebecca Whitmore, 32 years old according to her identification, and she was shaking so hard she could barely speak. Her husband was inside, she said, and he had a gun. Jamal called for backup while I approached Rebecca, keeping my voice calm and steady in the way 2 decades of experience had taught me. She told me her husband David had come home drunk, started yelling about dinner not being ready, shoved her into the kitchen counter when she tried to calm him down. When their son started crying, David had backhanded her across the face, then pulled a handgun from the closet and told them both to get out before he did something he would regret. Rebecca had grabbed the boy and run. She was crying now, telling me this was not the first time, that David had been getting worse over the past year, that she had called the police twice before, but nothing ever changed. I wrote down everything she said while my stomach twisted with the familiar rage that came from hearing the same story for the 26th year in a row. Backup arrived within 5 minutes, 2 patrol cars with officers I recognized from the precinct. We established a perimeter while Jamal tried calling the house phone. No answer. I approached the front door with my weapon drawn, standard protocol for armed suspect situations, while 3 other officers positioned themselves at the back and side entrances. Jamal stayed with Rebecca and the child, taking their formal statements. I knocked on the door and announced myself as police, ordering David Whitmore to come out with his hands visible. Silence. I knocked again, louder this time, repeating the command. The door opened and David stood there in jeans and an untucked dress shirt, no visible weapon, looking confused and irritated rather than threatening. He was tall, maybe 6'2", athletic build, clean-cut appearance that would photograph well in a courtroom. He asked what the problem was in a tone that suggested we were interrupting his evening rather than responding to his violence. I told him we had a report of domestic assault and needed him to step outside. He laughed and said his wife was being dramatic, that they had argued but nothing physical happened, that she was always overreacting and wasting police time. I asked about the gun. David's expression shifted slightly, calculation replacing confusion, and he said he owned firearms legally and had done nothing wrong. I asked him to step outside again, more firmly this time. He complied, moving slowly onto the porch with his hands partially raised in a gesture of cooperation that felt performative. I could smell alcohol on his breath from 3 feet away. I asked if he had been drinking. He said he had a few beers with dinner. Nothing excessive. Certainly not enough to justify this circus his wife had created. One of the other officers moved into the house to secure the weapon while I kept David on the porch. Rebecca was still in the driveway crying, her son clinging to her, both of them watching David with expressions that mixed fear and exhaustion. David saw them and shook his head, muttering something about drama and manipulation that made my jaw clench. The officer emerged from the house holding a 9mm handgun in an evidence bag and confirmed it had been loaded. I arrested David Whitmore for domestic assault and weapons charges, reading him his rights while he protested that this was ridiculous, that I was destroying his life over nothing, that his wife was mentally unstable and making false accusations. He demanded to speak with his lawyer, which was his right, so I stopped engaging and processed him into the back of my patrol car. Rebecca gave her full statement to Jamal, describing not just tonight's incident but a pattern of abuse spanning 3 years. David had never hit her badly enough to require hospitalization, she explained, always careful to leave bruises where they would not show, always apologizing afterward and promising to change. She had stayed because she loved him, because he was a good father when he was sober, because leaving seemed impossible when he controlled all their finances and had threatened to take their son away if she ever tried. Tonight was different, because he had struck her in front of their child, had pulled a gun, had crossed a line that terrified her into finally calling for help. I drove David to the county jail while Jamal transported Rebecca and her son to the hospital for medical documentation of her injuries. David was silent for the first 10 minutes, then started talking in a calm, reasonable voice about how this was all a misunderstanding, how his wife had mental health issues he had been trying to help her manage, how she sometimes became hysterical and called the police as a manipulation tactic. He said I seemed experienced enough to recognize a troubled woman making false accusations. He said he respected law enforcement and understood I was just doing my job, but that this arrest would cost him his career as a financial consultant, would destroy his reputation in their community, would traumatize his son who needed his father. He spoke with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to talking his way out of consequences, and I said nothing because anything I said would end up in a complaint or lawsuit later. At the jail, I processed David through booking while he continued his monologue about injustice and overreach. The booking officer, a woman named Sergeant Rita Holloway, who had worked intake for 15 years, looked at David's clean record and professional appearance, then looked at me with an expression I could not read. She asked about the specifics of the arrest. I provided them in clinical detail, including the loaded weapon and the visible injury to Rebecca's face. Rita nodded and completed the paperwork. David was placed in a holding cell to await arraignment in the morning. His bail would likely be set low given his clean record and community ties. He would probably be home within 24 hours. Rebecca would have to decide whether to press charges, whether to get a restraining order, whether to risk the retaliation that often followed when abusers were challenged. The system would grind forward in its predictable pattern, and nothing fundamental would change. I returned to the precinct at 2 a.m. to complete my incident report. The paperwork took an hour, documenting every detail of the call, the arrest, Rebecca's statement, the weapon recovery. As I typed, I thought about the other domestic violence calls I had responded to over 26 years. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Women with black eyes and broken ribs and cigarette burns. Children hiding in closets while their fathers raged through houses. Victims who recanted their statements because they were financially trapped or emotionally manipulated or genuinely terrified of what would happen after police left. Abusers who received probation or anger management classes, or nothing at all, because the system prioritized rehabilitation over accountability. I had testified in dozens of trials where defense attorneys portrayed victims as vindictive liars and abusers as misunderstood men dealing with stress. I had watched judges issue restraining orders that were violated within days with no real consequences. I had attended funerals for women whose deaths could have been prevented if anyone had taken their fear seriously. The next morning, I went to the courthouse for David's arraignment. Rebecca was there with a victim advocate, her face swollen and bruised in the daylight. David appeared in an expensive suit with a lawyer who immediately argued for release on personal recognizance, citing his clean record, stable employment, and strong community ties. The prosecutor, a young woman named Ashley Dunn, fresh from law school, argued for substantial bail given the presence of a weapon and the severity of the assault. The judge, Honorable Kenneth Briggs, listened to both arguments with the weary expression of someone who had presided over 10,000 similar cases. He set bail at $5,000, which meant David needed only $500 for a bail bondsman. David's lawyer had him out within 2 hours. Rebecca stood in the courthouse hallway watching her husband walk free, her son holding her hand, both of them looking smaller than they had the night before. David walked past them without acknowledgement, got into a car with his lawyer, and drove away. I approached Rebecca to explain what would happen next in the legal process. She listened while tears ran down her face, then asked me a question I had heard countless times before. What was the point of calling the police if nothing changed? What was she supposed to do now that David was free and angry and would come home eventually? How was she supposed to protect her son when the system had just demonstrated it would not protect either of them? I gave her the standard answers about restraining orders and emergency protective orders and victim services resources. I gave her the phone number for the local domestic violence shelter. I told her she had been brave to call for help and that pressing charges was her decision, but that the prosecutor's office would work with her either way. Every word felt hollow because I knew the statistics. I knew that leaving was the most dangerous time for abuse victims. I knew that restraining orders were paper shields against determined violence. I knew that David Whitmore would likely escalate rather than stop. Rebecca thanked me and left with the victim advocate. I went back to the precinct feeling the weight that had accumulated over 2.5 decades of this work. Every domestic violence call was the same pattern. Respond to crisis. Arrest the abuser if there was sufficient evidence. Watch them get released within hours. See the victim return to the dangerous situation because leaving required resources and support most people did not have. The system was designed to process cases rather than protect people, to document violence rather than prevent it. I had joined the police force believing I would help people, would stand between the vulnerable and those who hurt them. Instead, I spent 26 years filling out paperwork about atrocities I was powerless to stop. The idealism had burned out years ago, replaced by cynical acceptance that this was just how things worked. My shift ended at 8 that morning, but I could not go home yet. I drove to the hospital where Rebecca and her son had been taken the previous night and found her sitting in the emergency department waiting area. She had not left because she was terrified to go home, terrified David would be there waiting. The victim advocate had helped her file for an emergency protective order, but it had not been served yet, which meant David was legally allowed to be at their house. Rebecca had no family in the area, and her friends were also David's friends, people who would take his side and tell her she was overreacting. The domestic violence shelter was full with a waiting list. She was trapped in that waiting area with nowhere to go, and a child who kept asking when they could go home. I sat with her and made phone calls to every resource I knew, trying to find somewhere safe for them to stay. After 2 hours, I finally located a shelter 3 towns away that had space. I drove Rebecca and her son to the shelter myself, off-duty and on my own time, because I could not abandon them to figure out public transportation while traumatized and exhausted. The shelter was a nondescript building with security measures and rules designed to protect residents from being found by their abusers. The staff were kind but overworked, processing intake paperwork while managing a dozen other families in crisis. Rebecca would have to share a small room with her son, would have access to counseling and legal advocacy, would be safe for the 30 days the shelter allowed before she had to find permanent housing. She thanked me repeatedly while signing forms, telling me I had given her hope that someone cared. I wanted to tell her that hope was dangerous, that the system would likely fail her again, but I just said I wished I could do more and left before my anger at everything became visible. I went home and tried to sleep, but could not stop thinking about Rebecca and her son. Could not stop thinking about all the other Rebeccas over 26 years who had looked at me with desperate eyes and asked for help I could not actually provide. The job had ground me down to nothing, had turned me into a cog in a machine that processed suffering without addressing its causes. I had wanted to be a guardian, had believed in protecting and serving, had thought the badge meant something noble. Instead, I had become an observer of horrors, documenting violence for reports that got filed away and forgotten. The gap between what police work was supposed to be and what it actually was had become unbearable. I was 3 months from retirement and pension and the comfortable life I had planned, but the comfort felt obscene now, felt like payment for complicity in a system that failed victims and enabled abusers. That afternoon, I got a call from Sergeant Holloway at the jail. She said something had happened I needed to know about. David Whitmore had made bail and been released, but before leaving, he had asked the booking officer questions about how restraining orders were served, whether there were penalties for contacting a protected person through third parties, what evidence standards applied in domestic violence cases. The questions were casual but specific, the kind of questions someone asked when planning how to circumvent restrictions. The booking officer had documented the conversation and flagged it as concerning, but there was nothing illegal about asking questions. Holloway was calling me because she had a bad feeling. The instinct developed from seeing the worst of human behavior for 15 years. She thought David was planning something and that Rebecca was in danger. She had tried to contact the victim advocate, but had not gotten through yet. She wanted me to know so I could warn Rebecca if possible. I called the shelter immediately, but they would not confirm whether Rebecca was there or provide any contact information, which was standard protocol to protect residents. I explained I was the arresting officer with urgent safety information, but they said they would pass along my message and have someone call me back. I waited 2 hours with no return call. I drove to the shelter and was denied entry, the staff correctly following procedures that protected their residents from being found. I left my contact information and a written warning that David Whitmore might be attempting to locate Rebecca, that he should be considered dangerous, that any attempt at contact should be reported immediately. The shelter director, a woman named Teresa Kovac with gray hair and exhausted eyes, took my warning seriously and said she would brief all staff and ensure enhanced security measures. She asked if there was any legal action being taken to keep David away. I explained about the emergency protective order that was still being served. Teresa shook her head and said protective orders meant nothing to determined men, that she had residents whose abusers violated orders repeatedly with minimal consequences. I went back to the precinct and found Jamal to brief him on the situation. He listened and said he had been thinking about Rebecca since the call, that something about the case had bothered him more than usual. He asked what we could do beyond following standard procedures. I said honestly, there was nothing, that we had done our jobs by arresting David and connecting Rebecca with resources, that the rest was up to prosecutors and judges and social services. Jamal asked how I could accept that after 26 years. I told him you accept it or you break, that this job required either emotional distance or constant rage, and I had chosen distance to survive. Jamal said he did not want to become that kind of cop, someone who saw suffering as routine and injustice as inevitable. I told him he would not last 5 years if he stayed emotionally invested in every case. He said maybe that was better than lasting 26 years and losing the reason he started. That conversation stayed with me through my next shift. Jamal was right in a way I had been avoiding for years. I had survived by becoming numb, by treating victims as cases rather than people, by accepting systemic failure as the unchangeable nature of the work. That survival had cost me something essential, some core belief that individual actions mattered and that justice was possible. I thought about Rebecca in that shelter, terrified and displaced from her life, while David was free and planning how to reassert control. I thought about her son learning that violence had no real consequences, that his father could hurt his mother and be home within a day. I thought about all the children I had seen over the years in domestic violence situations, their faces marked by trauma that would shape their entire lives. Some of them would grow up to be abusers themselves, repeating patterns they had learned. Others would struggle with relationships and trust and safety for decades. The cycle continued because the system intervention was theatrical rather than substantive. 3 days after David's arrest, I got another call from dispatch. Domestic disturbance at 1847 Maple Grove Avenue. Rebecca had gone home to collect belongings while she thought David was at work, but he had been there waiting. Neighbors reported hearing screaming and breaking glass. I was closest and responded immediately, arriving to find Rebecca's car in the driveway with the driver's side window shattered. The front door was open. I called for backup and approached with my weapon drawn, announcing my presence. David appeared in the doorway holding Rebecca by the hair, a knife pressed against her throat. Her son was visible behind them, frozen in the hallway. David looked at me and said, if I came any closer, he would kill her, that this was her fault for calling the police and ruining his life, that she needed to learn her lesson. His voice was calm despite the words, cold calculation rather than hot rage. I kept my weapon trained on him while trying to de-escalate, using the negotiation tactics I had learned in hostage situations. I told David that hurting Rebecca would only make things worse for him, that he could walk away now and we could resolve this peacefully, that his son was watching and would remember this moment forever. David said his son needed to see what happened to people who betrayed their family. He pressed the knife harder against Rebecca's throat, and a thin line of blood appeared. Rebecca was crying silently, her eyes locked on mine, pleading for help I did not know how to provide. Backup arrived and officers established positions around the property, but no one had a clear shot at David without risking Rebecca. We were at a standoff with a man who had nothing to lose and every reason to complete his violence. My 26 years of experience offered no solution that guaranteed Rebecca's survival. I made a decision that violated every protocol in my training. I holstered my weapon and held up both hands empty. I told David I was unarmed and wanted to talk, that I understood he felt wronged and wanted his side heard. I asked if I could approach slowly so we could discuss this situation without anyone getting hurt. David hesitated, his grip on Rebecca loosening slightly. He said I could come closer, but if I tried anything, he would cut her throat. I walked forward slowly with my hands visible, talking continuously in a calm voice about how we could find a solution, how violence would only destroy his future, how his son needed him to make the right choice. I got within 10 feet of them. Rebecca's eyes were wide with terror. David's hand was shaking now, adrenaline and alcohol and rage making him unstable. I needed him to release Rebecca or provide an opening for other officers to intervene safely. I kept talking, making eye contact with David, treating him as a rational person capable of making better choices, even though I wanted to hurt him for what he was doing. David started talking then, a rambling monologue about how Rebecca had humiliated him, how the arrest had cost him a major client, how his reputation was destroyed because his crazy wife had lied to police. He said he had only ever tried to be a good husband and father, but she was ungrateful and disloyal. He said if he could not have his family intact, then no one would have anything. The knife moved away from Rebecca's throat slightly as he gestured while talking. I saw the opening and took it, lunging forward and grabbing David's knife hand while using my body weight to drive him backward into the house. Rebecca fell free and scrambled toward the driveway, where officers grabbed her to safety. David fought me with desperate strength, the knife swinging wildly while we grappled. I felt the blade slice across my forearm, but maintained my grip on his wrist, slamming his hand against the doorframe until he dropped the weapon. Other officers rushed in and wrestled David to the ground, handcuffing him while he screamed threats and accusations. I sat on the porch steps while a paramedic bandaged the cut on my arm. It was not deep, maybe 10 stitches required, but the adrenaline was draining away and leaving me shaky. Rebecca was giving a statement to officers, her son with a crisis counselor who had arrived with the backup units. David was in a patrol car heading back to jail, this time facing attempted murder charges that would carry serious prison time. The case was solid now with multiple witnesses, including other officers. David would not walk away from this one easily. But looking at Rebecca and her son, both traumatized further by violence that could have been prevented, I felt no satisfaction in the arrest. The system had failed them twice. First, by releasing David so quickly after the initial arrest, then by making Rebecca desperate enough to return home, despite knowing the danger. The legal process would grind forward again, and David would eventually face consequences, but the damage was done. That child had watched his father hold a knife to his mother's throat. That trauma was permanent. I finished my shift and went home at midnight. My arm throbbed where the knife had cut me. I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and thinking about the previous 72 hours. David's initial arrest that changed nothing. Rebecca's desperate question about what the point was of calling police. The shelter director's resignation that protective orders meant nothing. Jamal's challenge about accepting injustice as inevitable. David holding that knife to Rebecca's throat while I tried to negotiate with someone who should have still been in jail. The moment I had holstered my weapon and approached unarmed because following protocol meant watching Rebecca die. The system had not just failed in this case. The system was designed to produce exactly these outcomes, creating the illusion of protection while providing none. Arrest and release and repeat until someone was dead, then act shocked and hold press conferences about domestic violence tragedies as if they were unpredictable natural disasters rather than foreseeable consequences of inadequate response. I thought about the funeral I had attended 6 years earlier for a woman named Patricia Long. She had called police 11 times about her husband's violence. 11 documented reports of assault, threats, intimidation. 11 arrests. Her husband had been released every time, sometimes within hours. Judges had issued restraining orders that he violated with impunity, facing brief jail stays followed by release and repeated violence. On the 12th call, Patricia was already dead when we arrived, beaten to death in her bedroom while her children hid downstairs. Her husband was arrested and eventually convicted of murder, sentenced to life in prison, where he would cost taxpayers $40,000 annually to house and feed. Patricia was dead at 34, her children orphaned and traumatized because the system had valued her abuser's freedom over her safety 11 times in a row. At her funeral, the police chief had given a speech about tragedy and awareness and the need for better resources. But resources were not the problem. The problem was a system that treated domestic violence as a private family matter rather than attempted murder in progress. I attended David Whitmore's second arraignment the next day. This time, the charges were attempted murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, violation of a protective order, and child endangerment. The prosecutor, Ashley Dunn, argued passionately for remand without bail given David's violence while released on the previous charges. David's attorney, a different lawyer now, argued that his client had been defending himself in his own home against police aggression, that the knife incident was misconstrued, that David posed no flight risk. Judge Briggs listened and set bail at $50,000, still low enough that David could potentially post it through a bondsman. Rebecca stood in the courtroom and said directly to the judge that if David was released, he would kill her, that she was begging for her life, that her son had already witnessed enough trauma. Judge Briggs said he understood her concerns but had to follow bail guidelines that balanced public safety with the presumption of innocence. David remained in custody, but only because his lawyer needed time to arrange the bond payment. I walked out of that courtroom and drove straight to the police station. I went to the chief's office and waited until he was available. Chief Gerald Thompson had 28 years with the department, 2 years more than me, and had climbed the administrative ladder through politics rather than street work. I stood in his office and told him I was resigning effective immediately. He asked what happened, looking genuinely concerned because I was 3 months from retirement and walking away from full pension benefits required vesting a complete term. I told him about the Whitmore case in detail, about David's quick release after the first arrest, about Rebecca trapped in a shelter with nowhere permanent to go, about responding to the second call and finding David with a knife to her throat, about the system failing at every stage to protect an obvious victim from an obvious threat. I told him I could not spend one more shift responding to domestic violence calls while knowing nothing I did would actually protect anyone. Chief Thompson listened and then gave me the speech I had heard him give to other officers over the years. He said police work was difficult and emotionally taxing, that we did the best we could within legal constraints, that the criminal justice system had many players and we controlled only our part. He said I had given 26 years of exemplary service and should be proud of the lives I had touched positively. He said walking away now meant losing my pension, meant throwing away financial security for my family, meant letting one difficult case define my entire career. He asked me to take a week off and reconsider, to not make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. I told him this was not temporary emotion, but accumulated understanding from 2.5 decades of watching the same failures repeat endlessly. I told him I could not take pride in exemplary service that amounted to documenting atrocities while pretending we were preventing them. I told him the pension was not worth the cost to my conscience. I left my badge and service weapon on his desk and walked out. Jamal caught me in the parking lot and asked what I had done. I told him I quit. He stared at me and asked if I was serious, if I was really walking away 3 months before retirement. I said I should have walked away years ago. Jamal asked what I would do for money, for health insurance, for all the practical necessities that required stable employment. I said I would figure it out, that there were worse things than financial struggle. He asked what I thought quitting would accomplish, whether my resignation would protect Rebecca, or change the system, or prevent the next domestic violence tragedy. I told him honestly it would accomplish nothing except preserving whatever integrity I had left, that I could not keep participating in a system designed to fail victims, could not keep wearing a uniform that represented protection we did not provide, could not keep going home every night knowing I had spent another shift processing violence rather than preventing it. Jamal said he understood but could not follow me, that he had student loans and a mortgage and family depending on his income. I told him I was not asking him to follow me, that everyone had to make their own calculations about what they could live with. He asked what he should do when he responded to the next domestic violence call knowing he was just documenting trauma that would repeat itself. I said he should do his job to the best of his ability and try not to become numb to the suffering, that the moment you stopped feeling the rage and grief was the moment you lost yourself completely. We shook hands, and I drove away from the precinct for the last time. My arm hurt where David had cut me. The wound would heal and leave a scar, a permanent reminder of the night I violated protocol to save someone the system had abandoned. That scar felt more honest than the badge had ever been. I went home and told my wife Anne what I had done. She listened without interrupting and then asked if I was certain about this decision, if I understood we would struggle financially without my pension. I said I was certain and that we would manage somehow. She asked what had finally pushed me to quit after all these years of talking about the problems but continuing anyway. I told her about Rebecca and David, about seeing that knife against her throat while knowing David should have still been in jail, about realizing that my entire career had been spent pretending to protect people while actually just filling out paperwork about their suffering. Anne said she had watched me become increasingly hollow over the past decade, had seen the work drain something essential from me, had worried I would reach retirement completely empty. She said if I had stayed 3 more months for the pension, she would have supported that choice, but she was relieved I had finally chosen my conscience over financial security. She said we would figure out the money together. The news of my resignation spread through the department quickly. Several officers called to ask if the rumor was true and why I had walked away so close to retirement. I gave vague answers about needing a change and personal reasons. Only Jamal knew the full story. The local newspaper ran a brief article about my departure, framing it as an early retirement after distinguished service. The reporter called for a comment and I declined. 2 weeks after I quit, I got a call from Teresa Kovac at the domestic violence shelter. She said Rebecca had asked about me, wanted to know if I was the officer who had quit over her case. Teresa asked if that was true. I said yes, but that it was not specifically about Rebecca, that her case had been the final incident in a long pattern of systemic failure I could no longer participate in. Teresa said Rebecca felt guilty that my decision to help her had cost me my pension. I asked Teresa to tell Rebecca that my resignation was my choice about my integrity and had nothing to do with anything she had done, that she should focus on her own recovery and safety. Teresa said Rebecca wanted to thank me in person if I was willing to meet. I agreed and drove to a coffee shop where Rebecca was waiting with her son. She looked better than the last time I had seen her, the bruises faded, her eyes less haunted. She thanked me for saving her life the night David held the knife to her throat, said she had been certain she was going to die until I approached unarmed and gave her the chance to escape. She asked why I had quit my job over what happened. I explained that it was not just about her case, but about 26 years of responding to domestic violence calls where the system failed to protect victims despite their courage in asking for help. I told her that her question in the courthouse about what the point was of calling police had exposed a truth I had been avoiding, that police intervention in domestic violence was mostly theatrical rather than protective. Rebecca said she felt responsible for destroying my career. I told her she had done nothing wrong, that her husband had made every choice that led to violence, that the system's failure was not her fault. Her son, whose name was Lucas, asked me why his dad had hurt his mom. I struggled for an answer that a 4-year-old could understand, finally saying that some adults had problems that made them hurt people they were supposed to love, that it was never the fault of the people being hurt. Lucas asked if his dad was a bad person. I said people were complicated and could do bad things without being completely bad, but that his dad had made very wrong choices that hurt people Lucas loved. Rebecca thanked me for not demonizing David to their son, said she was trying to help Lucas process what happened without making him hate his father entirely. I respected that, even though I thought David deserved to be demonized. Rebecca said she had gotten a permanent spot in transitional housing and was starting a job next week, that the victim services had connected her with a lawyer handling her divorce. She said she was terrified of the future, but also hopeful in a way she had not felt in years. I followed David Whitmore's case through news reports and contacts still in the department. He remained in jail for 3 months while awaiting trial, unable to post the $50,000 bail. His lawyer negotiated a plea agreement where David would plead guilty to aggravated assault and receive a 5-year sentence with possibility of parole after 3 years. The attempted murder charge was dropped as part of the agreement. Rebecca was consulted and agreed to the plea because it meant not testifying at trial and reliving the trauma publicly. David accepted the plea and was sentenced. 5 years for holding a knife to his wife's throat in front of their child, for a pattern of violence that had escalated over years, for terrorizing his family. He would likely serve 3 years and be released on parole with mandated anger management counseling that research showed was largely ineffective for abusers. In 3 years, Lucas would be 7 years old. David would be released and would have visitation rights as a parent unless Rebecca could prove he remained dangerous, which required resources and legal expertise she did not have. I found work as a security consultant for businesses, helping design safety protocols and train staff on threat assessment. The pay was less than half what I had made as a police officer, and there were no benefits or retirement plan. Anne went back to work full-time as a nurse to supplement our income. We downsized from our house to an apartment, sold 1 car, cut expenses everywhere possible. The financial strain was significant, but manageable. What surprised me was how much better I felt, despite the money problems. The constant weight I had carried for 26 years had lifted. I was no longer participating in a system that promised protection while delivering bureaucratic processing of violence. My work now had clear purpose and measurable results. Businesses implemented my recommendations and their security improved. I was not saving lives, but I was also not pretending to save them while actually documenting their destruction. 6 months after resigning, I was contacted by a journalist named Isabel Reyes, who was writing an investigative piece about police response to domestic violence. She had heard about my resignation and wanted to interview me about what had prompted it. I agreed and spent 3 hours talking to her about the Whitmore case and the broader patterns I had observed over my career. Isabel's article ran in a major newspaper and included interviews with multiple domestic violence survivors, prosecutors, judges, shelter directors, and police officials. The article documented how the system prioritized abuser rights over victim safety, how bail guidelines and legal procedures created revolving door justice that enabled escalating violence, how domestic violence homicides were nearly always preceded by documented police calls that resulted in inadequate intervention. The article quoted me extensively about the gap between police stated mission to protect and serve versus the actual outcome of documenting violence without preventing it. The article generated significant public attention and controversy. Police unions criticized it as unfairly attacking officers who were doing difficult work within legal constraints. Domestic violence advocates praised it for exposing systemic failures survivors had been describing for decades. The police chief was interviewed and defended department procedures while acknowledging room for improvement. Several legislators announced plans to introduce bills strengthening domestic violence response, protocols and bail restrictions for repeat offenders. I received dozens of messages from current and former police officers thanking me for speaking honestly about problems they had also witnessed but felt unable to discuss publicly. Several survivors of domestic violence wrote to share their own stories of system failure, describing experiences that mirrored what I had observed. One woman described calling police 23 times about her husband's violence before he finally killed her sister who had been trying to help her escape. She said she wished one of those officers had quit in protest, had done anything to signal that the system's failure was unacceptable rather than routine. A year after resigning, I was invited to speak at a conference on criminal justice reform. I talked about domestic violence as a test case for whether the justice system prioritized protection or procedure. I argued that treating domestic violence as individual isolated incidents rather than patterns of escalating danger was a fundamental failure that cost lives. I described the Whitmore case in detail, walking through each decision point where the system could have protected Rebecca but chose procedure over safety. I challenged the audience of police officials, prosecutors, judges, and legislators to examine their own practices honestly and ask whether they were preventing violence or just documenting it for reports no one would read until someone was dead. The response was mixed. Some attendees thanked me for articulating problems they recognized but felt powerless to address within rigid bureaucratic structures. Others accused me of being unrealistic about resource constraints and legal limitations, of blaming individuals for systemic problems beyond their control. Rebecca attended that conference and spoke on a panel about survivor experiences with the justice system. She described feeling abandoned by every institution that was supposed to protect her, from police who arrested her husband but could not keep him away, to courts that set low bail and light sentences, to social services with waiting lists for shelter beds. She described the terror of knowing David was being released within hours of arrest and that she had nowhere safe to go. She described watching me approach David unarmed while he held a knife to her throat and thinking that this stranger was risking his life for her while the system designed to protect her had done nothing. She said my resignation had showed her that individuals within broken systems could choose integrity over institutional loyalty, that refusing to participate in injustice was sometimes the only moral choice. Her words made me cry in front of 300 people because they validated a decision that had cost me financial security and left me uncertain whether it mattered. After the conference, Rebecca and I talked about creating an organization focused on police accountability and domestic violence response. She had been working with victim advocacy groups and had connections to survivors willing to share their stories. I had insider knowledge of police procedures and relationships with reform-minded officers. Together, we founded the Domestic Violence Police Accountability Project, a nonprofit that documented cases where police response had failed to prevent escalating violence despite clear warning signs. We collected data on arrests and releases and subsequent violence. We published reports showing patterns of systemic failure. We advocated for policy changes, including mandatory arrest holds for domestic violence involving weapons, stricter bail guidelines for repeat offenders, better training for officers on lethality assessment, and increased funding for victim services. The work was volunteer-based initially because neither of us had money for salaries, but it gave purpose to the trauma we had both experienced. 2 years after David's conviction, he was released on parole after serving 3 years of his 5-year sentence. Rebecca was notified of his release date only 2 weeks in advance. She had to explain to Lucas, now 6 years old, that his father was getting out of prison and would have court-ordered visitation rights. Lucas had been in therapy for 2 years, working through the trauma of witnessing violence. The therapist recommended supervised visitation in a neutral setting, which the family court agreed to. David would be allowed 4-hour visits with Lucas twice monthly at a supervised visitation center. Rebecca was terrified but legally powerless to prevent it. She called me the night before David's first scheduled visit, crying and asking how this was justice, how the man who had held a knife to her throat was now being given access to their son. I had no answer, except that the system prioritized parental rights over children's safety, that David had completed his sentence and was legally entitled to rebuild his relationship with Lucas. The first visitation happened under supervision with social workers monitoring David's interactions with Lucas. David was reportedly calm and appropriate, playing games with Lucas and avoiding any discussion of the past. The supervising social worker noted in her report that David seemed genuinely remorseful and motivated to rebuild trust with his son. After 6 months of successful supervised visits, David's lawyer petitioned for unsupervised visitation. Rebecca opposed it through her attorney, providing documentation of David's history of violence and Lucas's ongoing trauma symptoms. The judge reviewed the evidence and the positive supervisory reports and granted David unsupervised day visits, reasoning that he had completed his sentence, attended all required counseling, and demonstrated appropriate behavior during supervised visits. Rebecca called me devastated, saying she was losing control of her son's safety to a man who had terrorized them both. I contacted everyone I knew in victim advocacy and legal fields trying to find some way to prevent the unsupervised visits. But the legal consensus was that David's rights as a parent would prevail unless Rebecca could prove current danger rather than past violence. The first unsupervised visit was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. Rebecca texted me throughout the day while Lucas was with David, barely able to function from anxiety. When Lucas was returned that evening, she questioned him carefully about what they had done and whether he felt safe. Lucas said they had gone to a park and gotten ice cream, that his dad had been nice and had not yelled or hit anyone. Over the following months, the visits continued without incident. David moved from day visits to overnight visits. Lucas began spending every other weekend with his father. Rebecca struggled watching her son develop a relationship with the man who had traumatized them both, but the court viewed this as healthy reunification. David sent Rebecca messages through the court-monitored communication system about Lucas's activities and school performance, playing the role of concerned co-parent. On the surface, the system was working as designed. The offender had been punished, had completed rehabilitation programs, and was successfully reintegrating with his family under legal supervision. 3 years after David's release, Rebecca called me at 2 a.m. Lucas was in the emergency room with a concussion and broken arm. He had been staying at David's apartment for the weekend. Lucas told the hospital staff he had fallen down the stairs, but Rebecca did not believe him. The injuries were too severe, and Lucas was acting terrified. When Rebecca questioned him privately, Lucas initially stuck to the fall story, but eventually broke down and said his dad had pushed him during an argument about homework. David had told Lucas that if he told anyone the truth, his dad would go back to prison, and it would be Lucas's fault. Rebecca had called the police, and they had taken a report, but David was claiming Lucas was lying because he was angry about discipline boundaries. Without witnesses, and with Lucas's initial statement supporting the fall story, the case was difficult to prosecute. David's parole officer investigated and found insufficient evidence of abuse. The visits continued. Rebecca was destroyed by this development, blaming herself for not finding a way to prevent David's access to Lucas, blaming the system for prioritizing David's parental rights over Lucas's safety, blaming me for failing to change anything by quitting my job and starting our advocacy organization. I could not argue with her assessment. Despite 3 years of work documenting system failures and advocating for reform, we had accomplished almost nothing meaningful. Policy recommendations were ignored or watered down. Funding for victim services remained inadequate. Police response to domestic violence continued following the same patterns that prioritized procedure over protection. David Whitmore had terrorized his family, served a minimal sentence, and was now abusing his son, while the system gave him the benefit of the doubt. The cycle continued exactly as it had for the 26 years I had worked as a police officer. My resignation had accomplished nothing except making me feel morally superior while changing nothing for people who actually needed protection. I met with Rebecca, and we discussed how to proceed with Lucas's situation. She wanted to fight for termination of David's parental rights, but her lawyer said that required proving severe abuse, and that Lucas's inconsistent statements weakened the case. We documented everything and filed reports with Child Protective Services, but they were overwhelmed with cases involving more obvious abuse. Lucas continued visiting David every other weekend. Rebecca sent Lucas with a hidden recording device during one visit, which was illegal and inadmissible as evidence, but gave her documentation of David verbally berating Lucas for being weak and stupid. She played me the recording, and I heard David using the same calm, controlled tone he had used while holding a knife to Rebecca's throat, explaining to Lucas that sometimes physical discipline was necessary to teach lessons, and that his mother was filling his head with lies about the past. The recording was chilling but legally useless. 4 years after David's release, Rebecca was granted a hearing to revisit David's visitation rights based on accumulated evidence of emotional abuse and the suspicious injury incident. Lucas was now 10 years old, and old enough that his preference would be considered by the court. The hearing lasted 2 days with testimony from Rebecca, Lucas's therapist, Child Protective Services investigators, and David. Lucas testified privately to the judge about not feeling safe with his father, describing verbal abuse and constant criticism and fear of making mistakes that would anger David. David's attorney presented evidence of his completion of parenting classes, his stable employment, his compliance with all parole requirements, and testimony from his therapist that he had processed his anger issues and developed healthier coping mechanisms. The judge praised Rebecca for her advocacy for Lucas's well-being and acknowledged the documented concerns, but ruled that the evidence showed David had made substantial progress and that maintaining father-son relationship was in Lucas's best interest. The visits would continue with a requirement that David complete additional therapy focused on communication with children. Rebecca walked out of that courtroom broken. She told me she had exhausted every legal option and the system had failed Lucas at every turn, just as it had failed her. She said she understood now why some domestic violence victims disappeared with their children despite the legal consequences. That watching your child be harmed while the system forced you to facilitate ongoing contact with the abuser was unbearable. I had no comfort to offer because she was right. The system had failed completely, and my resignation had changed nothing. Lucas would continue visiting David and experiencing abuse the system refused to acknowledge as severe enough to warrant intervention. Rebecca would continue living with the knowledge that she could not protect her son from the man who had terrorized them both. David would continue manipulating the system while hurting his child in ways that left no physical evidence. Everything I had witnessed over 26 years as a police officer continued unchanged, just with different names and addresses. 5 years after my resignation, Isabel Reyes published a follow-up article about what had happened to the people involved in her original investigation. She interviewed me and Rebecca and documented how David's case had proceeded from his release through the ongoing visitation disputes. The article showed that despite reforms passed in the aftermath of the first article, implementation had been minimal and outcomes remained largely unchanged. Domestic violence victims still struggled to access shelter beds and legal representation. Police still arrested abusers who were released within hours on low bail. Courts still prioritized family reunification over survivor and child safety. The article generated less attention this time because the public had moved on to other issues. No legislators announced new reform plans. No significant changes resulted. The article documented failure but inspired no solutions. I struggled with depression after that article, confronting the reality that my resignation had been a symbolic gesture without practical impact. I had walked away from my career believing that refusing to participate in an unjust system was morally superior to complicit participation. But my refusal had not changed the system or protected anyone. Rebecca and Lucas were still trapped in a nightmare the system had created and perpetuated. Countless other families faced similar situations daily. The officers who had replaced me at the department were responding to domestic violence calls and following the same inadequate procedures, documenting violence that would escalate until someone died. My resignation had been about preserving my own integrity rather than actually helping victims, which made it fundamentally selfish, despite whatever noble motivations I had claimed. I had quit to feel better about myself while the people I was supposed to protect continued suffering. Rebecca sent me a message around that time saying she did not blame me for any of what had happened, that I had done more than most people by trying to help and by speaking publicly about systemic failures. She said her anger was at the system rather than individuals within it, that she understood I had reached my breaking point and had made the choice that felt necessary for your own survival. She said she was grateful for everything I had tried to do, even though it had not changed the outcome for her and Lucas. Her forgiveness felt undeserved, but helped me begin processing the guilt I carried about resigning without accomplishing anything meaningful. I had thought that refusing to participate in injustice would somehow create change, that my resignation would draw attention to problems that would inspire reform. But systems did not change because individuals walked away. They changed only through sustained collective action and political will, neither of which existed for domestic violence reform despite decades of advocacy. 6 years after resigning, I started training police officers on domestic violence response through a private consulting program. The work felt contradictory, given why I had quit. But I reasoned that improving individual officers' understanding might create marginal improvements in outcomes even without systemic change. I taught lethality assessment and trauma-informed interviewing and the importance of treating each call as potentially life-threatening rather than routine disturbance. Many officers were receptive and thanked me for providing context that their academy training had omitted. Some were defensive and argued that legal constraints prevented them from doing more. A few were openly hostile and suggested I had quit because I could not handle real police work. I endured the hostility because reaching even a portion of officers meant potentially better outcomes for some victims. It was incremental work without grand transformation, but it was something concrete I could do. Lucas turned 13, and Rebecca reported that his relationship with David had deteriorated further. Lucas openly resented court-ordered visits and had started refusing to go. Rebecca supported his resistance, but the court threatened her with contempt charges for not facilitating visitation. Lucas ran away twice during scheduled visit weekends. The court ordered family therapy for Lucas and David, which became another arena for David to manipulate perceptions while Lucas withdrew further. Rebecca was exhausted from years of fighting legal battles while working full-time and trying to help Lucas heal from ongoing trauma. She told me she sometimes fantasized about taking Lucas and disappearing, moving to another state, and changing their names despite the legal consequences. I understood the impulse even though it would likely make things worse if they were found. The system had trapped them in an impossible situation where protecting Lucas required breaking laws designed to protect parental rights. 7 years after I resigned, David filed for increased custody, requesting 50-50 shared parenting time with Lucas. His attorney argued that Lucas's resistance to visitation was due to Rebecca's influence rather than legitimate concerns about David's behavior, that Rebecca had engaged in parental alienation by portraying David negatively. The hearing examined Lucas's therapy records and school performance and interviews with teachers and counselors. Lucas, now 13, was old enough that his testimony carried significant weight. He told the judge he was terrified of his father, that visits involved constant criticism and emotional abuse, that he had nightmares about being forced to live with David half the time. David's attorney argued that Lucas had been coached by Rebecca and that his statements reflected manipulation rather than authentic feeling. The judge ruled that the evidence did not support parental alienation, but also did not support reducing David's existing visitation. The status quo would continue with ongoing family therapy. Rebecca called me after that hearing and said she could not continue fighting anymore, that 7 years of legal battles had destroyed her financially and emotionally, while changing nothing. She said Lucas would have to survive the visits as best he could until he turned 18 and could refuse contact legally. She said she had failed as a mother to protect her son from his father, that every choice she had made to work within the system had resulted in Lucas being harmed. I told her she had not failed, that the system had failed her and Lucas repeatedly, that she had fought harder than anyone could reasonably expect. She said that distinction meant nothing when your child was suffering. I had no response because she was right. The why of the failure mattered less than the fact of Lucas's ongoing trauma. 8 years after my resignation, I received a call from Jamal, my former partner. He had left the police department the previous month after 12 years. He said he had finally reached the point I had reached, where continuing to participate in a system that failed domestic violence victims became unbearable. He had responded to a call where a woman had been beaten by her boyfriend for the 4th time in 6 months. Each previous call had resulted in arrest and quick release. This time, the woman was hospitalized with internal injuries. The boyfriend posted bail within 8 hours. Jamal had gone to visit the woman in the hospital, and she had asked him the same question Rebecca had asked me 8 years earlier. What was the point of calling police if nothing changed? Jamal said he had no answer and realized he could not keep doing this work while knowing it was mostly theatrical. He had resigned that week and was now working private security. He called to thank me for being honest years ago about the cost of staying in a broken system, even though he had not been ready to hear it then. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.